Welcome back. Welcome back to another episode of the Always About People show. Last week we were off location and it was a recorded show, but for this episode we're back live and I'm coming to you from Charlotte, North Carolina. It is the last week of January. It's hard to believe. For those of you who are watching us live right now on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, it's the last week of January. For those of you who are watching this recording, I promise you it will still be practical. But given that we are in the final week of January, I had a thought on a really practical topic to cover today. The title of this show is How to Remain Resilient in Your Resolutions. And the thought was this. We get to the end of a year, we start a new year, 2022. We have all of these great goals, these New Year's resolutions, these ambitions, these initiatives that we've put forth. And we get in motion in January, we get excited about them. But then if you're like me or many of the organizations that I work with, whether it's an individual goal or an organizational initiative, you find yourself losing a little steam, losing a little motivation. The initiatives sort of fall away. The goals are forgotten. All of a sudden, you find yourself in a failure to keep what you were so excited about putting in place this year. And so the question that came to me, even over the past couple days, is why does that happen? Why does it happen that we come out with great intentions, but then can so easily fall back into either bad habits or just the forgetfulness of what we put in place? And so today's show, I want to cover just some thoughts on what's happening in our brains. Number one, how we can set better goals, how we can improve the way we think about it, and how we can ultimately have the power to stick with our resolutions. So again, this is the Always About People show. We try to cover topics and issues and challenges that have to do with people. And just this weekend, actually started Friday, I was with a leadership team and we were on an offsite as we try to do some strategic planning and goal setting for 2022. We spent Friday going through strategic planning. We developed a SWOT for the organization. If you're unfamiliar with that terminology, it just stands for strengths, oftentimes the internal strengths of an organization. The W stands for weaknesses. These are internal weaknesses or challenges of the organization. The O stands for opportunities, and these would be opportunities external to the organization. And then the T for SWOT stands for threats, and these are external threats that you have no control over. So both opportunities and threats are external. You lack the control of them. And so oftentimes with organizations and with leadership teams, we're developing the SWOT. And the SWOT analysis allows us to determine, okay, how do we now strategize areas within the organization that we want to build some goals around or some initiatives around? And so maybe this is just for you personally, but the same thing holds true at the end of a year. You get to the end of the year and you go, okay, what are my personal, you might not put it this way, but you're thinking, what are my personal strengths? What are some weaknesses that I want to improve? What are some opportunities that I have in my own life? And then what are some threats that could come against that? So whether you do this organizationally or you do it personally, it still works. And so again, the thought would be we go from this SWOT analysis to then go, how do I prioritize some of these opportunities, some of these things that I can control, some of these ways that I can become better this year? And through prioritization, that's how you get to goal setting. So with this leadership team, we came out Saturday morning, and the process runs pretty much the same from client to client. But Saturday morning, we take what we prioritized the day before, and we begin to set some goals. And around goal setting in particular, you got to think through, okay, how do we set proper goals for the betterment of the organization? And again, I'm sure you've heard of the acronym before, SMART goals. SMART just simply stands for S being specific. Is the goal specific enough? Have you defined what you're truly trying to achieve? The M stands for measurable. Is there some measurement to determine whether you have succeeded or not? The A stands for achievable. And while that's a part of the acronym of SMART, I would say, and we'll challenge you later, that sometimes the best goals are the ones that you think might not be achievable. They're a little bit of a stretch. So you've got specific, measurable, you've got achievable. The R is relevant. Is this goal relevant to the strategy that you're trying to accomplish? And then the T is just timely or time bound. When do I want to achieve this? What's the time frame that I want to accomplish this? So again, when you're setting goals individually or corporately, you go through this process of either a SWOT analysis or some form of identifying strategies and priorities. Then you take those priorities and you begin to develop goals. And in those goals, you want to make sure that they fall into the SMART format. Now you have your goals. But a lot of us stop there. And that's where I want to pick up the topic for today. This wasn't a show about how to do a SWOT analysis or set SMART goals. It's actually a show about how you go from setting to then achieving. Because the question is, if we're really good at SMART goal setting, why don't more people accomplish what they set out to? And I just believe it has a lot to do with what's going on in our brains. In fact, there have been multiple studies showing the benefit of taking goals and actually writing them down. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But all the way back to 1979 Harvard study, and then a study in 2015 by Dominican University in California, all backed up empirically the benefit of writing down goals. And I believe it's because it does something to you mentally. So here's what I believe is actually happening. I believe that in our minds, we fall back into old attitudes and habits and beliefs about goal setting. And those actually lead us to failure or forgetfulness. So what happens in our brains is that you have a feeling. Oftentimes it's referred to as the affective component of developing an attitude. And I apologize, we'll get a little bit scientific here, but I'll try and make it as practical as possible. But any attitude is developed by an affective component called a feeling. Like I feel something. So again, in a fear or in an anxiety or even around goal setting, it could be, I feel like goals are regularly broken or forgotten. Okay, that's a feeling. Or I feel like lots of people set New Year's resolutions and then within a couple weeks, they stop doing them. That's the affective component. That moves into the behavioral component where you actually act on a feeling. So the behavioral is sort of the way the attitude influences how we act or behave. So if you took, I feel like people give up on goal setting, then the behavior would be, and so then they stop doing them. And whatever they set out to eat or whatever sort of routine they set out to accomplish, or even in an organization, whatever they set out to do, they actually stop doing. That's a behavioral. And then the cognitive component is when you turn both the feeling and the behavior into an actual belief. So that's when I go, I feel this way. Now I stop doing it. Therefore, goal setting is actually ineffective. And that becomes a belief. So in our minds, what we do is we take a feeling, we turn that into a behavior, we then turn that into a belief, and now I have an attitude about goal setting. So for some of us, we came into this year and we're like, okay, this is a new year. I'm going to believe that goal setting is going to work for me this year. But the belief that is stored in our subconscious is one that says, goal setting has never worked for me before. It doesn't work for most people. I feel like most people give up. They stop doing it. And therefore, really, this goal setting stuff doesn't ever work. And that's all going on in your mind. And so let's just think for a second how our minds work. We're taking in senses, what you see, smell, feel, touch. Okay. So the five senses, hearing, tasting, are bringing in thoughts and perceptions. And then what happens is that those perceptions are stored. Those perceptions are stored in our subconscious, and the perceptions of those realities are not what is actually stored in your subconscious. It's what you think about those perceptions. So now reality isn't even stored in your mind. It's actually just what you think about a perception. That's what's in your subconscious. So as we start every year, we get started in goal setting. We set great goals. We have positive thoughts around them. We get into it, and all of a sudden, the first time there's a slight little hiccup in the process, we sleep through the alarm. The chocolate is in front of us, and we knew we weren't supposed to eat it. The sugar is there. I'm at an event. I'm at somebody's home for dinner. I can't offend them. But what's really going on in our mind is I knew that goal setting wasn't effective. Remember, I've created the belief system. My subconscious has stored that. And so therefore, my thinking around goal setting in general is really affected by my belief system. Okay, pause. Science is over. Let's get practical. So whether you're an individual or an organization, you put these great goals in place. And yet the reality is most of us and most of our team members have done this before. They've set goals before. They've been ineffective at actually keeping those goals. Nobody kept them in front of them. They were written down, not remembered, but the memory that's stored is that goal setting becomes a failure. So we all come into goal setting with these high expectations, but what is actually stored in our minds is this never works. So the issue is what you see is actually what you get. And so one thought that I want to leave with you is the way that we see goal setting, or the way that we interpret it, what is stored in our subconscious, will actually determine what happens with your process. So let me give you a couple of real practical examples. This is the same concept as if you've ever driven a car or been with a race car driver. I once had the opportunity to go to the BMW racing school down in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And with a professional driver, he made a comment. He said, "You have to look through the turn." And that was a foreign concept to me. I'm teaching some teenage boys how to drive right now too. I have a new 16-year-old in the home, and most of us will look slightly ahead of us in the road. But I was trying to teach my 16-year-old, you can't look straight down, because if you look straight down at the road in front of your vehicle, you'll hit the cars in front of you. So you have to look in front of you. But what this race car driver was telling me is you actually have to look through the turn. So if you're turning, you're supposed to look through really the glass on the passenger door through the turn. And when you look there, the car will follow. That's the same concept mentally of looking and perceiving and viewing and being able to go there with our goal setting. The same thing is true of golf. If we have any golfers who are watching, like when you get up to a hole and you're teeing off and there's water in front of you with a green on the other side, what do you see? For the amateur golfers like me, I see water and I immediately start to think, what was the last thing that happened when I saw water? I have this core belief. I'm probably going to hit it in the water. All I see is the water. And therefore, when I tee off, the ball goes in the water. Professional golfers and really good golfers, they don't see the water. They see the green on the other side. And they are completely focused on that end point. So they have rewired their brains. This has to do with neuroplasticity. This has to do with neural pathways. But they have rewired their thought process to, instead of being focused on the belief system that this is going to fail, I'm going to hit in the water, I can't look through the turn, they have rewired their brains to think differently. So my challenge to you is, how do you rewire your brain this year? And there is some science and even some language around this that I'd love to share with you. The concept is called a crisis catalyst. How do you create a catalyst in your mind that requires change? So this is the example. There really has to be an internal discomfort where you would say that unless I change the way I think about goal setting, I will never achieve my goals or my ideals. So I have to create this intentional crisis catalyst in my mind where I need to develop change around how I think. And it's in that crisis catalyst that I can begin to think and change the way that I perceive, the way that I feel, the way that I turn that into a behavior, and the way that my behavior turns into a belief, which ultimately creates my attitude about goal setting. Now, you might think this is like psychobabble. This makes no sense. However, there is a ton of science behind what you say in your mind. And all of us have much more control over our attitudes, feelings, beliefs, behaviors than we ever thought possible. And so in 2022, one of the things that I want to challenge you with, and the topic of this episode is, how can you create this intentional crisis catalyst and begin thinking differently? How can you rewire your feelings, your behaviors, and your beliefs about goal setting in particular, or resolutions in particular, so that we can see a better performance this year? So a few little practical examples. Number one would be write it down. And if you have kind of mentally set some goals for yourself this year, maybe you made some New Year's resolutions, maybe they've just been made in your head, I want to encourage you, there's something really statistically significant about writing those goals or resolutions down. Same thing for an organization. Maybe you're a leader watching, write the goals down. Now, the second thing is, it's not enough to just write those down. Those need to be repeated, because what happens in our minds is that some people refer to them as affirmations. But how do we begin to rewire how we think about goals? Here's a core belief. I think most of us, in our self-talk, which happens all the time, we set these goals, we feel really great about ourselves, but upon the first moment of failure, we begin to remind ourselves through our self-talk, I'm a failure. I've never reached goals before. I've always had difficulty with these resolutions. How do I remain resilient because I'm a failure? Well, that talk just created a picture, just like the golf game and looking through the turn, where I can guarantee that you will end in failure. So instead, how do we create self-talk and affirmations around, no, I am a person who keeps my goals? And you go from writing down the goals to now, what I want to encourage you, step two would be write down what are oftentimes referred to as affirmations. And the way to think about an affirmation is you write down who you are in the future. So think about who you want to be at the end of 22 and write those down as statements. I am a healthy individual who works out 5 days a week. I am a healthy individual who has reduced sugar. Whatever those goals were at the beginning of the year. Organizationally, I think we need leaders who will write down goals and then begin thinking, we are an organization who trains and develops people well. We are in an organization who attracts great talent. And those affirmations work for individuals, but they also work for organizations. So a couple takeaways. Number one, write the goals down. Number two, begin thinking about how to turn those goals into actually written affirmations and begin to speak that over yourself or over your organization. Because what I'm hearing a lot of right now is some negative self-talk, even from organizations, like we are struggling to attract talent. We have an attrition problem. How are we going to retain our culture in a remote or hybrid environment? And that self-talk becomes a belief system in the minds of every person in your organization who hears that. So my encouragement to leaders is let's change the language. So 1, write down goals. 2, begin to turn those into affirmation. 3, begin to change the language. For individuals, it's changing the self-talk. For organizations, it's let's change the language that we're using even within our teams and within the organization. So instead of hearing people and allowing them or tolerating them to complain about customers, which will be a self-fulfilling prophecy, let's instead talk well about our customers. Like, man, we are so grateful for the work and the business that we have this year. We are so thankful for XYZ customer. We are an organization who trains and develops people well. We are an organization who values people. We are an organization who cares about our people. We are an organization of community where people feel like they belong to something bigger than themselves. And so, again, we're trying to change the language because what's really going on scientifically is that is changing and rewiring your brain. You are creating an intentional crisis catalyst to change the way that you talk about things in order to actually bring about change in behavior. So let's rewind to something earlier in the conversation. I talked about how attitudes are developed. Attitudes are developed by an affective portion or an affective element, we'll say, that has to do with how you feel about something. That turns into a behavioral component, which is how you act towards that thing, which then turns into a cognitive component, which is a belief. So attitudes are created by feelings, behaviors, and then beliefs. But if we can go back and actually be intentional about creating this crisis catalyst, we can change the way that we talk about things, both internally through self-talk and in our organizations, and we can rewire the brains of our organizations. We can actually get people to start thinking differently about goal setting and about resolutions. So a few practical things that I left you with. Number 1, let's write these goals down because there is empirical evidence in the power and benefit of writing goals down. That would be number 1. Number 2 is to really take those goals and begin writing affirmations. Number 3 is that you would begin to repeat and reinforce those affirmations, both in your own mind, but also verbally within organizations. And I guess with that one, I would say in organizations, every meeting should be a time when you repeat or reinforce the goals and initiatives that you have in place for the year. The more that you can repeat those in front of people, the more they will repeat them themselves. And once again, the talk becomes actual behavior and action. So as I thought about this topic, how to remain resilient in your resolutions, what I am challenging myself to this year is I've written down some goals. I've written down some goals for always about people. I've written down some goals personally as a father, as a husband, as a friend. I've written down some goals for different areas of my life. And then I've also tried to write down affirmations like I am looking at the end of 2022 and I am stating over myself, I am affirming over myself who I'm going to be at the end of the year. And I'm trying to reinforce that communication. Organizationally, it's the same concept. You as leaders constantly reinforcing who you want to be as an organization, even if it is aspirational. will begin to convince people mentally, even in their own attitudes, of who the organization wants to be. And so again, there's a lot of science behind how talk affects our mental state, but I just want to encourage you this year to change the way you talk about things. Because again, what is said in your mind and what is said verbally in organizations will actually have an effect on how people feel. It could change the neural pathways that are in place or have become pretty stale in people's minds. And let's begin to believe differently about our goals, about our initiatives, and about how we feel about really accomplishing them. So, this week's show, this episode, how to remain resilient in your resolutions, change the way you talk about them. Change the way that you talk about them, the goals, the initiatives, and change the way that you think about yourself accomplishing those goals. There's incredible power in your subconscious and really what is stored, the perception that's stored around the term resolution or goal. Let's change that this year. Thank you for joining us live. I hope that you were able to take away one thing that was practical about this today. Maybe it's go write down the goals. Maybe it's go write down some really powerful affirmations about who you want to be at the end of the year. Maybe it's organizationally, it's, gosh, we need to start every meeting this year with, hey, remember, this is what we're trying to accomplish this year. Maybe it's just starting every meeting with, here's the aspiration of the company. We want to be a place that creates love and belonging for people. We want to be a place that values people. We want to be a place where you have a best friend at work. Whatever it is, let's start to repeat those, even verbally, because those affirmations actually change the pathways in our brain. They change what we believe, and I won't repeat it all, but they begin to change the attitudes that we have about certain things. I hope this was helpful for you. Just a reminder, follow us here at the Always About People show. Like, subscribe, whatever platform you're watching on. You'll get reminders and updates of when the next show is. We do this show every Tuesday at noon Eastern live. Hopefully you'll join us for the next show. We'll have a great guest for you and a relevant topic. Thanks for joining us today.